The year was 1905, and New York City was a bustling metropolis, filled with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, the hiss of steam engines, and the constant hum of voices in crowded streets. But amid the noise, a shadow lingered, creeping silently into the hearts of unsuspecting citizens. Within the walls of a small, seemingly ordinary church, whispers of devotion twisted into something darker. Congregants arrived each Sunday unaware that beneath the veneer of piety and worship, a force was gathering, insidious, calculating, and lethal. The cult's leader, a man whose charisma masked cruelty, had convinced his followers that salvation lay in obedience, that ultimate enlightenment required sacrifice, that trust in him alone would secure their eternal peace. Families walked into the church, children in tow singing hymns, unaware that they were stepping into a carefully orchestrated trap where faith itself would become their undoing. The poison was prepared with meticulous care, hidden in vessels meant to convey blessings and Holy Communion. Each drop was calculated, measured, and delivered with precision, ensuring that all who partook would feel nothing until it was far too late. The congregation, full of hope and devotion, never suspected the deadly ritual that awaited them. The leader's words, smooth as silk, promised a transcendence beyond mortal suffering, a communion with the divine that required absolute trust. They drank, they prayed, they trusted, and as the poison took hold, screams erupted in a chorus that would echo through the city for decades. Outside, the streets remained oblivious. Children played, street vendors hawked their wares, and life continued as if nothing had changed. But inside that church, horror unfolded in real time. Men clutched their chests, women fell into spasms, and the sound of coughing, gasping, and terrified wails filled the wooden rafters. The air was thick with panic, mingling with incense and candle smoke, a grotesque parody of worship. Those who tried to flee found doors blocked or locked, a calculated measure to ensure no one escaped the fate that awaited them. The congregation, united in faith, became united in suffering, every heartbeat synchronized in terror, every breath a countdown to death. When the authorities were finally alerted, it was already too late. The streets outside were silent save for distant cries and the wail of approaching sirens. By the time the first responders arrived, dozens were dead or dying, their bodies twisted in agonized positions on the pews and floor. The leader had vanished into the labyrinth of New York's alleys, leaving behind chaos, grief, and a community shattered beyond comprehension. Investigators would later describe the scene as apocalyptic, a place where faith and devotion had been weaponized, where trust had become a death sentence, and where humanity had been betrayed in the most intimate of sanctuaries. The city reeled in disbelief. Families mourned, newspapers screamed headlines of horror, and the survivors carried the trauma for the rest of their lives. Whispers of curses, divine punishment, and malevolent forces spread like wildfire, feeding fear and suspicion across neighborhoods. Some believed the church itself had become tainted, a nexus of evil that could never again host worship. Others blamed the leader entirely, claiming that his charisma had been a mask for pure malice, that his understanding of chemistry and human psychology had allowed him to orchestrate the perfect mass poisoning. No matter the explanation, one fact remained undeniable. A congregation had perished at the hands of a cult that preyed on trust, faith, and devotion, leaving an indelible scar on the heart of New York City. The psychological aftermath was as chilling as the physical. Survivors described recurring nightmares of pews filled with bodies, faces frozen in horror, and the suffocating sense of betrayal by a trusted figure. Families avoided churches, questioning the very nature of faith and morality. Psychologists and local scholars debated the causes, from fanaticism to mental manipulation, but none could fully account for the scale of devotion turned deadly. The poison was gone, but the effect lingered, a haunting reminder that belief, when twisted, could be more lethal than any weapon. Even decades later, the story of that Sunday in 1905 remained etched in the collective memory of the city. It was recounted in hushed tones in newspapers, books, and lectures, a cautionary tale of trust misplaced and devotion corrupted. The cult itself vanished, its leader disappeared into history, but the legacy of fear, grief, and unanswered questions endured. The church walls, once a place of sanctuary, became symbols of danger, a reminder that human faith, no matter how pure, can be exploited with horrifying consequences. The year was 1905, and New York was a city teeming with life, progress, and stark contrasts. Skyscrapers were beginning to scrape the sky, horse-drawn carriages clattered over cobblestone streets, and the sounds of industry mingled with the chatter of pedestrians in crowded markets. Immigrants from across Europe and beyond poured into the city, seeking opportunity, faith, and belonging. Neighborhoods were tight-knit yet insular, with churches acting as pillars of community, guiding daily life, education, and morality. Among these sanctuaries, one modest church in the Lower East Side stood out, not for grandeur, but for its devoted congregation and the magnetic presence of a new preacher who had arrived with promises of spiritual enlightenment and salvation. The cult's leader, Reverend Elias Whitmore, was a man whose charm masked an unsettling intensity. With his piercing gaze, eloquent speech, and apparent devotion to God, he drew in parishioners eager for guidance. Whitmore preached of a world beyond suffering, where obedience and faith would secure a place in paradise. Yet beneath the sermons of hope lay subtle manipulations. He questioned the teachings of other ministers, portrayed himself as the sole conduit to divine grace, and slowly isolated the congregation from friends, family, and outside counsel. Families who trusted him found themselves increasingly dependent, believing that salvation, morality, and protection all resided within the walls of the church and in adherence to Whitmore's doctrine. The church itself was unremarkable in appearance. Wooden pews polished by decades of devotion, stained glass windows filtering light into colored patterns, and a single organ filling the halls with solemn music. Yet it became a crucible of control. Whitmore meticulously curated every detail: the hymns, the timing of sermons, the arrangement of seating, and even the discussions in the small community gatherings he hosted throughout the week. Those who attended regularly felt comforted by structure and ritual, unaware that the same predictability was facilitating manipulation, conditioning, and eventually destruction. His followers were ordinary men and women, bound by faith and a desire for community. They were merchants, laborers, homemakers, and children, people who sought solace and guidance. Over months, Whitmore introduced teachings that blurred morality and obedience, insisting that the faithful should fully surrender their will, follow instructions unquestioningly, and accept the unknown consequences of divine trials. Gradually, suspicion of the outside world was cultivated. Outsiders were dismissed as corrupt, greedy, or untrustworthy. This isolation, psychological conditioning, and subtle intimidation created a congregation utterly reliant on the preacher's judgment, a population poised for catastrophe without even realizing it. Preparations for the eventual mass poisoning were meticulous. Whitmore studied chemistry in secrecy, gathering knowledge about toxins that could be disguised in common substances, harmless in appearance yet deadly in dosage. Rumors of special communion began circulating, framed as a path to spiritual awakening, the ultimate test of faith. Parishioners looked forward to this ritual with reverence, believing they were about to participate in a sacred event, unaware of the mortal danger awaiting them. The poison was integrated into meals and ceremonial wine, with exact measurements calculated to ensure maximum effect and minimum immediate suspicion. The plan was cruelly methodical. A congregation united by devotion would become victims of trust itself. Children attended with parents, learning hymns and prayers, their innocence unshielded from the looming horror. The church's basement, where the poison was prepared, was hidden from public view, locked behind doors known only to Whitmore. Followers were conditioned to believe that everything their leader did was divinely inspired. Any questions or hesitation were framed as moral weakness or spiritual inadequacy. Over time, the community had unknowingly become a living experiment in manipulation, obedience, and lethal devotion. On the fateful Sunday, the church was filled to capacity. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass, casting colorful mosaics across wooden pews. The congregation sang hymns, their voices intertwined in harmony, unaware that these would be their final moments. Whitmore moved among them, distributing the tainted communion and observing the ritual unfold. The air was thick with incense and the scent of polished wood, masking the chemical subtlety of the poison he had introduced. The congregation drank, following ritual and faith, and the first effects were delayed just enough to ensure that trust was never broken, before catastrophe struck. In the streets outside, New Yorkers went about their routines, oblivious to the disaster unfolding within the church walls. Life was vibrant, ordinary, and unknowing, contrasting sharply with the death silently claiming the faithful inside. Panic would later erupt in chaos, but at this moment, the congregation remained unified in worship, a community unwittingly bound by lethal obedience. The story of Reverend Whitmore's control, the meticulous preparation and the innocence of those gathered forms, the chilling foundation for the events that would follow. The days leading to the fateful Sunday were marked by subtle shifts in the church's atmosphere. Reverend Whitmore's sermons became increasingly intense, emphasizing obedience, devotion, and the rewards of unwavering faith. Parishioners noticed nothing amiss. In fact, many felt a deepening sense of purpose, a certainty that they were being guided toward divine favor. Yet, behind closed doors, preparations were unfolding with chilling precision. Chemicals were procured under the guise of remedies and cleansing agents, hidden in vials and flasks, their deadly purpose masked by the preacher's charisma and authority. The congregation remained blissfully unaware, lulled into trust by years of guidance, rituals, and the comforting cadence of repeated prayers. Whispers began circulating quietly among a few attentive observers. Some parishioners noticed minor inconsistencies, unfamiliar scents, subtle changes in taste, or a brief hesitation in the preacher's demeanor, but these suspicions were dismissed. Whitmore's influence was absolute. Doubt itself was a sin, and questioning his actions was framed as rebellion against God. Families, desperate for moral guidance and social cohesion, ignored instincts that would have otherwise warned them. The church, once merely a sanctuary, had become an incubator of fear and control, shaping the minds and expectations of everyone who entered. The rituals, the hymns, and the communal gatherings reinforced obedience, while subtle psychological manipulation ensured no one acted against the preacher's will. Preparations for the poison's administration intensified. Whitmore's private quarters became a laboratory of death. Compounds were mixed with care, designed to be tasteless, odorless, and slow-acting. The timing of each dosage was meticulously calculated, ensuring that the congregation would partake without suspicion, and that the onset of symptoms would be delayed long enough to prevent escape or resistance. Meals were carefully planned, prayers timed, and every element of the Sunday gathering choreographed to perfection. The anticipation of spiritual reward masked the deadly reality, turning faith into a weapon. Community members spoke of small omens in the days prior, sudden illness among parishioners, minor but unusual incidents in the church, unexplained fainting spells, and whispered warnings that were quickly forgotten or dismissed. Children began recounting dreams of shadowy figures and strange smells in the air. Adults noted fleeting dizziness or odd tastes in food and drink. Yet Whitmore's authority quelled concern. The preacher framed every anomaly as divine testing, a chance to prove loyalty, reinforcing the dangerous obedience that would culminate in tragedy. The day of the mass gathering approached. The congregation prepared as usual, arranging pews, lighting candles, and rehearsing hymns. Whitmore moved among them, providing reassurance and instruction, his presence a mask for the horror to come. The community's dependence on his guidance had reached its peak. No one questioned the untested new sacrament he introduced, each person trusting that faith alone would protect them. Outside, city life hummed along as if untouched. The juxtaposition of ordinary routines against the gathering storm inside the church, heightening the tension of the impending catastrophe. Rumors outside the church remained sparse, but unsettling. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the preacher's intensity, the unusual hours of preparation, and the secrecy surrounding church operations. Some wondered why families were so utterly committed, why children appeared withdrawn after services, why congregants never discussed anything outside Whitmore's supervision. These suspicions failed to reach any ears capable of intervening, lost in the city's noise, ignored as paranoia or prejudice against a charismatic spiritual leader. Inside, the congregation's anticipation reached its zenith. Hymns were sung, prayers whispered, and the faithful approached the communion ritual with reverence. Whitmore's voice commanded attention, projecting authority, comfort, and an almost hypnotic persuasion. The poison, hidden in the sacramental bread and wine, awaited its victims. As the first sips were taken, the initial effects were subtle: slight dizziness, a momentary cough, barely perceptible discomfort. No one suspected the slow-acting poison, trusting that the ritual itself was a source of divine blessing. The faithful continued in song and prayer, unaware that each heartbeat synchronized in shared devotion was also counting down toward collective tragedy. The meticulous planning, psychological conditioning, and social isolation created a perfect storm. Fear of divine punishment, loyalty to community, and dependence on Whitmore's guidance ensured that every precaution he had taken would succeed. By now the congregation was ensnared, completely reliant on the preacher, completely vulnerable and completely unaware that faith had been weaponized. Every action, every word, every gesture had been calculated to maintain trust while preparing for death. The day's rituals, so ordinary in appearance, had become instruments of mass destruction, the culmination of months of manipulation, preparation, and careful psychological orchestration. Even the architecture of the church played a role. Doors were strategically locked or blocked, windows provided minimal visibility, and the pews were arranged to maximize control over movement. Any attempt at resistance would be futile, preemptively countered by Whitmore's planning. Every inch of space reinforced submission. The very structure of worship became a cage. It was within these walls, under the guise of sanctity, that ordinary people would become extraordinary victims, their trust exploited to lethal effect. As the congregation sang the final hymn before communion, a palpable tension hung in the air, unnoticed by most, felt only as a vague unease by a few. The culmination of manipulation, preparation, and psychological conditioning was complete. The scene was set, the actors unwittingly in place, the ritual primed for the horrors that would unfold. The city outside remained oblivious, life continuing with mundane normalcy, a cruel contrast to the impending carnage. Every detail was perfect, every variable controlled, and every soul about to pay the ultimate price for faith misdirected and trust betrayed. The fateful moment arrived with a quiet inevitability, the culmination of months of meticulous planning and psychological manipulation. Inside the modest New York church, the congregation gathered for what they believed would be a sacred ritual, unaware that faith itself had been weaponized. Reverend Elias Whitmore moved among the pews, his calm demeanor a mask for the carnage he had orchestrated. The poisoned communion was distributed with precision, bread and wine seemingly ordinary, now vessels of death. Parishioners accepted them without hesitation, their trust absolute, their devotion unbroken. Children sat beside their parents, repeating hymns, their innocence a chilling counterpoint to the horror about to unfold. The initial effects were subtle. A cough here, a slight dizziness there. Barely perceptible signs that went unnoticed in the chorus of prayer and song. Whitmore observed, his eyes glinting with a mixture of anticipation and cold calculation. Soon the symptoms intensified, faces contorted in pain, hands clawed at throats, and gasps filled the rafters. Panic erupted as the poison took hold, transforming the once harmonious congregation into a scene of chaos and terror. People collapsed into pews, bodies convulsing in spasms, the scent of burning incense mingling grotesquely with the chemical taste of the poison. Attempts to flee were futile. Doors were locked or blocked, windows offered no escape, and the preacher's presence dominated every moment. Families cried out, searching for one another amidst the chaos, but the poison acted swiftly and indiscriminately. Screams echoed against wooden walls, mingling with the crackle of candles and the organ's unplayed music, creating a symphony of horror that would linger in the city's memory for decades. The methodical preparation ensured that no one could survive by chance. Every movement, every attempt at aid was anticipated and rendered useless. Children's cries were the most heart-wrenching. Parents struggled to shield them, but the effects were inevitable. Small bodies collapsed beside larger ones, their eyes wide with confusion and fear, their trust in the ritual betrayed in the most devastating way possible. The church, once a sanctuary of hope, had become a mausoleum. Every pew, every aisle, every corner bore witness to the culmination of human malice disguised as divine instruction. The congregation, unified in devotion, was now unified in death, a testament to the lethal power of manipulated faith. Whitmore remained at the center, surveying the scene with clinical detachment. Each death, each gasp, each convulsion confirmed the success of his plan. The poison, carefully calculated to act slowly enough to prevent suspicion but quickly enough to ensure mass mortality, had fulfilled its purpose. Bodies twisted unnaturally, limbs intertwined with those of loved ones in frantic attempts at comfort, creating a tableau that resembled both ritual and massacre. The sanctity of communion had been perverted into a mechanism of destruction, an ultimate betrayal of trust. Outside, unaware citizens went about their routines. Street vendors shouted prices, carriages rattled along cobblestone, and children played in alleys. The city's normalcy contrasted violently with the horror inside the church, the two worlds existing side by side, oblivious to one another. By the time the first responders arrived, dozens had perished and survivors were few, vomiting, gasping, and racked with pain. The scene was described later as apocalyptic, a place where human devotion had been transformed into suffering by the manipulation of one man. Investigators were horrified, documenting the scene meticulously. The architecture of the church, the precise placement of pews, the distribution of poison, and the strategic blocking of exits all pointed to a premeditated massacre. Survivors recounted Whitmore's charisma, his smooth instructions, and the subtle psychological conditioning that had kept them compliant until death struck. Autopsies revealed the chemical composition of the poison, each dose calculated to maximize fatality while leaving no immediate suspicion. The depth of planning and cold calculation left the city reeling, unable to comprehend the scale of cruelty that had unfolded under the guise of faith. The aftermath within the church was gruesome. Candles burned low, incense mixed with the metallic tang of blood and chemical residue, and the pews remained littered with bodies locked in final convulsions. The stench was overpowering, a mixture of devotion and decay. Journalists and photographers documented the horror, their images spreading across newspapers, cementing the day in the annals of the city's history. Families of the dead wept openly, while survivors were haunted by visions of convulsing bodies, children in the throes of death, and the unrelenting presence of the man who had orchestrated it all. The aftermath of the mass poisoning was immediate, overwhelming, and catastrophic. New York City awoke to news of a horror that had occurred in plain sight, yet was inconceivable to comprehend fully. Families of the victims received telegrams, or hurriedly rushed to the church hoping that loved ones had survived, only to be confronted with unimaginable tragedy. The streets surrounding the church became crowded with mourners, journalists, police officers, and curious onlookers, all drawn to the scene of one of the deadliest religious cult attacks in the city's history. Bodies were removed from the pews, covered hastily with sheets while the living were carried away in a state of shock and delirium. The scale of death left city officials scrambling to manage both the physical cleanup and the psychological impact on the population. Survivors recounted the horror with trembling voices. They described the moments leading to collapse, the sudden dizziness, the escalating nausea, the terrifying realization that those around them were succumbing in real time. Many of them carried scars for the rest of their lives, both physical and psychological. Panic, grief, and disbelief became dominant emotions, seeping into neighborhoods, workplaces, and homes far beyond the church walls. Mental health professionals, at the time though few in number, documented the effects, noting widespread trauma, survivor guilt, and recurring nightmares. Children who had witnessed their parents die were left orphaned in the midst of chaos, their innocence shattered irrevocably. Authorities launched a full investigation into Reverend Elias Whitmore, but by the time they arrived at the scene, he had disappeared into the city's maze of streets. His prior meticulous planning left few clues. Chemical residues were traceable but could not point directly to him without his presence. Witnesses described his charisma, the way he guided and reassured the congregation, and how his influence ensured compliance even in the moments leading up to death. Investigators struggled to reconcile his outward piety with the meticulous, cold-blooded planning that had transformed a place of worship into a scene of mass murder. Newspaper headlines screamed of betrayal, fanaticism, and horror, drawing national attention and fueling debates about the power of charismatic religious figures and the dangers of blind obedience. Religious communities across New York grappled with the implications. Churches were scrutinized, sermons questioned, and clergy who had previously been trusted were met with suspicion. The psychological impact was compounded by fear that such manipulation could happen anywhere, to anyone. Families questioned their own faith, wondering how piety and devotion had been weaponized to deadly effect. Public discourse centered on the duality of human nature, the capacity for both spiritual devotion and calculated cruelty. Scholars later, analyzed Whitmore's methods, documenting his use of isolation, psychological conditioning, and social influence to engineer compliance and maximize fatality. Hospitals were overwhelmed with the injured. The poison, slow-acting but lethal, left survivors with extended suffering. Physicians struggled to understand the chemical composition, as forensic science at the time was limited. Families and friends helplessly watched loved ones deteriorate, knowing that treatment was minimal or non-existent. The combination of chemical toxicity and shock-induced trauma created a grim tableau of suffering, compounded by the emotional devastation of witnessing friends and family perish. Relief efforts were organized, but the scale of death and injury challenged every available resource, highlighting both the tragedy and the systemic limitations of public health responses of the era. The city's legal and law enforcement systems were pressed to respond. Attempts to trace Whitmore led to a trail of false identities, clandestine contacts, and vanished records. Investigators speculated that he may have left the country or disappeared into the underground networks of New York, but definitive conclusions were impossible. The inability to apprehend him compounded public horror, leaving a community desperate for justice, but forced to grapple with the limits of law, order, and human accountability. The very skill that had allowed him to manipulate his followers now insulated him from punishment, creating an enduring sense of injustice. Communities mourned collectively, holding vigils, memorials, and funeral services. The tragedy resonated beyond New York, inspiring articles, books, and lectures that warned of the dangers of cults, manipulation, and blind devotion. Survivors shared stories in hushed voices, passing along lessons learned through suffering. The mass poisoning became both cautionary tale and symbol of the vulnerabilities inherent in human trust, devotion, and faith. Generations later, descendants of victims recounted the events as cautionary legends, ensuring that the horror remained in public memory. Even after the immediate horror had passed, the events of that Sunday in 1905 continued to baffle authorities, scholars, and the public alike. The precise nature of Reverend Elias Whitmore's manipulation remained enigmatic. How had one man, however charismatic, managed to control an entire congregation to such a lethal degree? Scholars studied surviving journals, letters, and witness testimonies, but each source raised more questions than answers. Whitmore's knowledge of chemistry, psychology, and social influence suggested meticulous planning, yet the seamless execution of the mass poisoning seemed almost superhuman, as if guided by forces beyond mere human calculation. Rumors proliferated, some whispering of a curse, others of supernatural intervention, while skeptics argued for a purely scientific explanation of chemical toxicity and human obedience. Investigators were haunted by the absence of the cult leader. Despite extensive manhunts, police records, and informant networks, Whitmore vanished without trace. Some speculated that he fled the country, adopting new identities in Europe or South America. Others believed he died shortly after the massacre, perhaps driven to despair by the enormity of his own actions. No evidence ever confirmed either theory. The church itself, though reopened later, remained shrouded in suspicion. Locals avoided it for years, reporting strange sounds, sudden chills, and a lingering sense of unease. Visitors claimed that the very air inside seemed heavy, as if saturated with memories of pain, death, and betrayal. Survivors continued to experience psychological torment. Nightmares were pervasive, visions of pews filled with convulsing bodies, children grasping parents who could not save them, and Whitmore's cold, unyielding gaze. Even decades later, these recollections haunted the faithful, leaving scars on their mental health that were never fully addressed by the limited psychological understanding of the era. Many sought solace in other forms of faith, yet none could escape the memory of the betrayal they had endured at the hands of a man they had trusted with their lives. Some turned to prayer, others to alcohol, and a few completely withdrew from society, unable to reconcile devotion with mortal vulnerability. The chemical used in the poisoning was equally mysterious. While some forensic analysis identified components consistent with known toxins, the precise formulation and dosage strategy remained elusive. Whitmore had tailored the poison to act gradually, ensuring compliance and preventing panic until it was too late. The blend of chemistry and timing suggested an intelligence far beyond that of a typical criminal, adding to the aura of the inexplicable. Modern researchers later attempted to reconstruct the poison, only to encounter limitations imposed by incomplete historical records and degraded samples. Each attempt confirmed that the event could not be explained by negligence or chance. It had been the product of deliberate, calculated, and almost preternatural skill. Rumors of divine punishment or a curse circulated for years. Local newspapers reported unusual occurrences in the church long after the event: flickering lights, unaccounted footsteps, and fleeting apparitions in the stained glass windows. Skeptics dismissed these as coincidence, fear, or hysteria, but believers interpreted them as evidence of a lingering spiritual malediction. The idea of a curse transformed the tragedy into legend, ensuring that the story of the poisoned congregation transcended mere historical fact, entering the realm of myth. The church itself, a simple brick building, became a symbol of both human vulnerability and supernatural possibility. Attempts to locate Whitmore's associates or followers met with little success. Some disciples disappeared along with him, while others claimed ignorance, shock, or divine forgiveness. The cult as an organization dissolved, leaving a void of unanswered questions. How complicit were other members? Did they act willingly, or were they themselves manipulated? These uncertainties fueled ongoing debates in both legal and academic circles. Psychologists analyzed patterns of obedience, sociologists explored group dynamics, and historians cataloged the event as an unparalleled example of religiously motivated mass homicide. Yet none could fully capture the complexity or the scale of psychological manipulation involved. The legacy of mystery extended to every corner of the city. Families avoided churches, citizens distrusted spiritual leaders, and law enforcement developed protocols for cult-related risks that would influence policy for decades. The unanswered questions of Whitmore's fate, the methodical execution of the poisoning, and the enduring reports of supernatural phenomena ensured that the story of 1905 remained embedded in the collective consciousness. Even today, the tale of the cult that poisoned its entire congregation serves as a chilling reminder of how faith, when twisted, can become a weapon, and how some horrors defy simple explanation. The legacy of Reverend Elias Whitmore and the poisoned congregation lingered long after the last victim had perished, embedding itself into New York City's dark history. The church, once a symbol of spiritual guidance, remained forever tainted, its pews a silent witness to betrayal and death. Survivors carried invisible scars, memories of faces convulsed in agony, the smell of incense mingled with chemical poison, and the horrifying realization that the man they had trusted had orchestrated their suffering. Families were shattered, children orphaned, and the city's faith in religious authority profoundly shaken. Whitmore's disappearance compounded the anguish, leaving the world with no closure, no justice, and no certainty that such manipulation could not happen again. Communities struggled to process the magnitude of the tragedy. Scholars wrote extensively on the intersection of charisma, psychological control, and chemical lethality, attempting to decipher the human and scientific elements behind the massacre. Psychologists examined obedience, social conformity, and manipulation, while criminologists dissected Whitmore's planning and methodology. Despite decades of research, questions remained unresolved. How had one man gained such absolute control? Could the tragedy have been prevented with intervention or awareness? Was the poison's precise formula a product of genius or a perverse stroke of luck? These questions haunted the city, scholars, and descendants of victims alike. The church itself became a site of whispered stories and local legends. Even after renovations and new leadership, the building carried the weight of memory. Visitors reported strange occurrences: flickering lights, sudden chills, and fleeting shadows among pews where hundreds had died. Skeptics dismissed these as coincidence, but for many, they were evidence that some residue of evil, some echo of Whitmore's manipulation, remained. The story of the poisoned congregation transformed into cautionary legend, a warning that human trust, when exploited, could become a weapon capable of unimaginable destruction. Families of victims established memorials, commemorating the lives lost and ensuring that future generations would remember the horror that faith misused could unleash. Descendants recounted stories of courage, obedience, fear, and betrayal, teaching lessons about vigilance, critical thinking, and the dangers of unquestioned authority. Yet no memorial could fully contain the grief, nor could any ceremony undo the deaths of hundreds who had gathered in devotion only to encounter treachery and poison. The scale of tragedy remained a permanent stain on New York's history, a dark chapter that would never fade. Whitmore himself became a phantom, a subject of speculation and fear. Reports claimed sightings in Europe, South America, and even clandestine New York neighborhoods, but none were verified. His fate remained a mystery, his motives partially understood yet entirely horrifying. The absence of accountability added to the collective dread, as the man responsible for orchestrating one of the deadliest religious mass murders evaded justice entirely. His legacy was one of fear, manipulation, and the devastating consequences of unchecked charisma. Historians and psychologists would later cite the 1905 mass poisoning as a defining example of how trust, obedience, and faith could be weaponized. It became a case study in the fragility of human judgment under authority, in the psychological mechanisms of control, and in the lethal potential of scientific knowledge wielded without conscience. The story served as a constant reminder that evil could hide behind charm, authority, and piety, waiting for the moment to strike. Survivors, scholars, and storytellers ensured that the lessons of Whitmore's manipulation remained etched into public consciousness, a dark beacon for generations to come. Even today, descendants of survivors recount the events in hushed voices, emphasizing the lessons learned. Faith, they warn, must be tempered with scrutiny, trust measured with reason, and devotion, guided by morality rather than blind obedience. Whitmore's shadow, though physically absent, continues to loom over the narrative of human vulnerability, illustrating how a single individual's cunning and malevolence can irrevocably alter lives, communities, and history. The church stands, reconstructed yet haunted. The city thrives yet carries scars invisible to the eye. Memory, legend, and fact intertwine, ensuring that the mass poisoning remains a chilling tale of manipulation, poison, and shattered faith. The story of 1905 is not merely a historical account. It is a stark reminder of the darkness lurking within human influence, the devastating consequences of blind obedience, and the fragile line between devotion and destruction. Humanity's fascination with the macabre endures, but so too does the cautionary legacy of a preacher who weaponized faith to claim lives, leaving a trail of death, mystery, and unanswerable questions.